Our first speaker will be Chris Hamlyn. He's an assistant professor of kinesiology and serves as the program director for athletic training education here at AU. He's a 2007 graduate of Manchester, earning a Bachelor of Science in Athletic Training and Exercise Science. He went on to complete a master's degree in kinesiology with a specialization in athletic training from Indiana University in 2009. He worked as a certified athletic trainer at Lapel for 2 years before returning to the college level at AU in 2001 as an assistant athletic trainer and preceptor for the academic program. After 3 years in this position, he returned to his education at Ball State to start work on his doctorate, and that's in sports performance, higher education with a sports performance cognate, where he is currently ABD. He joined the Department of Kinesiology in 2015. The title of his presentation is Perceptions of Preceptors for Athletic Training Programs on the Incorporation of Formal Debriefing Techniques into Clinical Education. Chris.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to start off by admitting to all of you that it is a little more intimidating standing up in front of all of you and the cameras and the lights than I'm used to with just my students. So you'll have to bear with me probably just a little bit. But I know all of you are way too nice to tell me how much worse my presentation is than Dr. Varner's. So I'm sure we'll be good to go, but I'm going to be picturing a bunch of empty chairs this whole time, if that's all right with you guys. So we have a big problem in athletic training education, and it's probably one that a lot of you deal with in your own programs as well, and that's we're not really sure if our students are really learning. So it's a struggle that we deal with to try to really figure this out. Now we give them the tests. We all know that our students end up cramming the night before, memorizing as much information as they possibly can, putting it down on the test, and then for the most part forgetting the majority of what they just read. I often kind of wonder what would happen if I gave them the exact same test 2 classes in a row, besides my course evaluation scores plummeting down. That's kind of a given in that scenario, but it's always been kind of an interesting thought to me. Luckily for us in athletic training, we kind of have a next level. That's our clinical education component. So within the program, throughout their 4 years, they're going to end up completing literally hundreds of hours of clinical rotations. And the whole idea here is they actually have to apply the information that they're learning in the classroom in that clinical setting. So they're learning, right? Because we're seeing them apply this information. Or do they really learn? You see, I really think that students have actually kind of figured out a way around this as well. Students are really good observers, and they can get into that clinical experience and they can start looking at what their preceptors are doing. They can start looking at what the upperclassmen are doing, and then they can kind of just mimic and copy those same motions and get by in kind of the more basic situations that a lot of the underclassmen and students are really dealing with. So their thinking really falls apart quickly if they're getting put into any type of real complex clinical situation. So when looking at this, in the clinical education area, there's really kind of 4 main places that their thoughts could fall, or their thoughts and actions. They could end up using right thinking and have the correct actions, right thinking, right actions. That's great. They learned and they applied the information correctly. It's what we all want, right? So that's perfect. They could have the right thinking but end up reaching the wrong actions still. Okay? Not as good, but still we're right on that correct track. You know, they have the right thought process. They probably just need a little more experience at actually doing it to be able to get that right action. Then we move to wrong thinking, wrong action, which is the really bad one. They really don't know anything about what they're doing. The good thing about this is those students tend to stand out pretty well. We can see when they're really don't know what they're doing, and we can kind of intervene in that situation and do the correct remedial education. The last situation, they use the wrong thinking but end up reaching the right action. This is by far the hardest one to do anything about. It's hidden very well. We can see the action, we think they know what they're doing, but they've used very incorrect thought processes to end up reaching that action. It could be the simple, I saw him do it, so I'm going to do it. Or it could be we end up questioning them, well, why did you do that? Well, the book told me to do that, right? Which isn't going to actually work once they get out into a real clinical practice. They don't have that book right there to always tell them what to do. So this really matters quite a bit as we're trying to prepare our students to move forward and really start thinking like a professional so that they can handle these complex situations. So this is a slide, you guys should all thank me. I was going to go with the picture of Kevin Ware's injury, which if you're not aware of, it was an open tibial fracture. I was like, yeah, I'll calm it down a little bit and just go with an x-ray of the shoulder here. So complex situation, all right? So we want our students to really be able to use the correct thinking. Really no matter what department you're talking about here, all of us really have that goal to prepare our students that as soon as they walk across that stage of graduation, they can think like a professional. That's what I would assume most of us want our students to be able to do. For us in our clinical education component, we want them to be able to think like a healthcare professional. So this involves taking the information that they've learned and transitioning it into a practice that will improve patient care no matter the given scenario. So whether it's something they've been exposed to specifically during their clinical education component, whether it's something that we covered in class or not, if we can get them to think like a healthcare professional, they should be able to reach conclusions that are going to improve patient care. So that's our goal. So it's really important that we address these situations of those incorrect student thought processes so that as many times as possible throughout that clinical education component, they are continuing to build on those correct thought processes and continuing to practice their clinical skills using those correct actions. Now, luckily for us, there's a tool for this. It's called coffee. That's actually just my tool. All right. Real tool, as the title might say, is debriefing. So debriefing is a reflective process that's generally used immediately following, for our case, a clinical experience, but it really could be any type of educational experience. For debriefing to function properly, the facilitator needs both a structure to operate within, as well as specific techniques that end up leading to leading the student to have deeper reflections and the ability to have a deeper conversation about what just occurred. When this is accomplished, it's been shown to really be an effective tool for helping students develop those complex thought processes that we need to develop for for their future clinical work, including their clinical judgment, emotional responses, and complex decision-making skills. The common elements that are found in debriefing techniques are a critique of the actions, corrections to the actions, an evaluation of the student performance, and then a discussion about the experience. This is traditionally ended up being carried out through framing it through well, what went right, what went wrong, and what could you do better next time? All right, so that's a very traditional approach to debriefing. The problem is the more this technique's been used, the more they found that really falls short of our ideal for clinical education. It lacks the organization and a true methodological approach needed for our students to reach those higher levels of thinking. So it just doesn't quite get the job done on its own. So what do we do now? We move on to a developed technique called debriefing for meaningful learning, DML. So DML is a very highly structured process of debriefing that actually uses 6 distinct phases: engage, explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate, and extend. To accomplish these phases, you really need a significant interaction between the student and the educator. This ends up leading into an intensive questioning process where the student can really begin to develop the thought processes that are critical for their future clinical work. So within this process, the method is really moved away from the educator telling the student anything. So it's no longer, this is what you did right, this is what you did wrong, and it's really all about getting the student to think about their actions and question them on their actions. And within DML, this is called thinking in action, thinking on action, and then moves into thinking beyond action. And we'll get into a little bit more detail as I kind of go through the steps about how each of those works. So the first step is engage. Very, very key component of the debriefing method, especially for athletic training education. This is an element that, from how we've traditionally approached debriefing, has been missing. To begin with, this is a transitional period, so it's giving the students some time to pull away from that clinical experience they just had to transition to a place where they can really have that conversation with you. So giving them that little bit of time is part of the engage step. And then you really move into thinking on action. So there's actually some worksheets that go along with this step where the student reflects back, really trying to focus on the patient's story. This debriefing technique is really designed to isolate down that case or that specific patient that the student was just interacting with, and really trying to get them to see the whole picture of that patient. And then framing all the future steps off of that patient's specific story. So it's really important that they get that information, and then that they can have that period to reflect on their actions. So this is them thinking back over what they did with that patient. Then you're going to actually start in with the questioning. Asking them why they did certain things, how they did certain things, etc. And this is going to move you into the explore phase. So here the facilitator is going to guide the student through the findings that they had, the decisions they made, any type of responses that occurred, and the actions that they took. Within explore, you now take the reflection of thinking on action and start to move them into thinking in action. So you start to increase the questioning so that they're no longer just answering questions about what they did, but have to actively think about kind of why they did it and how the thought processes that they used. And the key here is trying to uncover any assumptions that the student used throughout that time. If you can find an assumption, whether it's a good assumption or a bad assumption, then you question that and you get them to justify that, that assumption that they made. And in finding the bad ones, then you can move into more of the explain phase. So this is where you're going to work to correct any of the bad assumptions that they made throughout this process. However, again, this is less the educator telling the students this is what you should have done, and instead questioning them and continuing to dig into the process until they can figure out that that was a bad assumption and that they should have asked different questions to lead them to the correct information. Then we move into the elaborate phase, because every educator loves to elaborate and give more information. So while this isn't the major focus of debriefing for meaningful learning, when it's appropriate, it is definitely beneficial for the educator to elaborate on things they believe are specific skills that are really needed within professional practice. So they can go a little bit beyond what that case actually presented. This could be a true emphasis on one critical element that they felt the case presented, or just some concept of interest that educator has. So they might just try to expand the student's knowledge in that area, even though it's not directly applicable to that case. We then move to evaluate. So now we're going back over everything. Okay? And this has been found to be very important, so that those incorrect thought processes really kind of stand out to the student. And we kind of highlight back over those things so that we can really emphasize the correct thinking actions rather than just moving on after this phase. So going back over everything and reevaluating all of it. And then lastly is extend. This is where the educator gets to kind of start to play with the case a little bit, and they change little details on the student. Ask them, well, what if this? And they change a detail, make the student reapply their thought process and see if they're going to make another assumption or not. And you kind of continue to play with the case a little bit, pull at things, and have a little fun with the student. Well, fun for us, maybe not so much for them. So yay, we figured it all out, right? All of our students are good to go, graduate. They're all going to be the best professionals out there today, and our program's going to explode because we're the best, right? Unfortunately, maybe not so much. Debriefing for meaningful learning was a debriefing technique that was developed and has traditionally been implemented in nursing clinical education. So this is where my research has really started to come in to see if we can start to apply this type of technique into athletic training clinical education. My first step in this process was to actually go to those individuals who are delivering the clinical education for athletic training, and it's what we call our preceptors. So I really sought to develop a better understanding of the preceptors' knowledge of debriefing, how they're currently approaching student learning in clinical education, and how they believed that a more formal debriefing technique such as DML would work in their setting. So in order to do this, I approached this from a qualitative standpoint. Did some semi-structured interviews, then ended up with doing the thematic analysis approach to try to get a really good description of these preceptors' perceptions of debriefing in clinical education. This kind of opened up my ability to really explore how each of these individuals within kind of different unique clinical settings. So not all of these individuals were preceptors here at AU. There are some at high school settings, some at a Division I setting. So how each of them kind of approach this within their own different unique circumstances. So as I said, the participants that I used included preceptors from all these locations, but it was really key to me to only use preceptors who also had really full-time clinical appointments. Within athletic training education, the most common way we get our preceptors is to find certified athletic trainers who are already employed as full-time clinical athletic trainers who have a full caseload of patients, who are responsible for sometimes an entire high school all on their own, and then begging them to please take our students so that our students can gain some clinical experience with them. So by seeking these individuals out, I wanted to make sure that we are getting their perceptions, because they're the ones who, if we're going to continue with this much more formalized technique, then they're the ones who are going to actually have to carry this out. So I need to know what their thoughts are. So the first thing that really came out of this was that clinical education, the way they approach clinical education is really based on past experiences. So they're doing clinical education the way that they had clinical education done for them, which was the way that those individuals had clinical education done for them, and so on and so on and so on. And nobody's ever actually even attempted to approach this topic to see if we should do it any better. So they didn't feel like they got any specific training on how to be a better educator. They said, you did a great job on telling us what the accrediting body says we can and can't do with these students. We can't just make them do our job and go home and take a nap. But outside of that, we got the rules, but not much else, not much other support. The next thing that came about from this is they all kind of understood the concept of debriefing, because there were a lot of these components, as we kind of talked through this process, that they were already doing. They were already questioning their students in certain circumstances and trying to get them to reflect back and doing those specific techniques, but in a very, very unstructured, informal, inconsistent, and also undocumented way. So it was very hard for them to really give me any specific examples of this, because it was just, yeah, no, I have them talk to me about what just happened, and then we move on. So they had the idea, but they didn't know how to implement it properly. The last finding of this was that they felt like there are a lot of barriers facing them delivering high quality clinical education. One of the first ones that they identified was actually the student taking some responsibility themselves. They felt like there was only so much they could do if the student wasn't also willing to engage in the process as well, which is pretty obvious and something that we need to address. The second one, which is prevalent in all athletic training education literature, is time. These preceptors felt like they're employed as full-time clinical athletic trainers responsible for the care of up to hundreds plus athletes, and then on top of that, they're preceptors, sometimes unpaid preceptors. So they felt like there was a balance there. They had this responsibility to that job, but then they wanted to educate these students, but they just didn't have the time to try to work through these processes. Which leads me to the road moving forward. So now I'm taking what I've learned from these preceptors, and we're starting to implement the techniques of debriefing for meaningful learning into our clinical education. And we really believe that by using this formalized process and by providing an in-depth education to the preceptors about how to conduct this, as well as giving the students a lot of responsibilities to in presenting the patient's case and talking about that story with their preceptor, that we have a really good opportunity to move forward and advance clinical education in athletic training. So we're going to implement it here for the rest of this semester. Hopefully by that point I'll be able to get some really good feedback from the preceptors. I'm also going to be looking at the students' perspective with it this time, to see if this technique is something that we can kind of grow from in athletic training education. I highly believe that this isn't going to work perfectly right out of the box. It wasn't developed for athletic training. So there's going to need to be some tweaks, but starting with this kind of really highly structured process and then moving on from there, maybe simplifying it down a little bit, I think we have a really good chance to do some meaningful work. So thank you for listening to me. If you found any of this interesting, feel free to buy me some coffee and I'll talk to you more about it. Or you can just Google my references that a lot of this is based off of. Thank you very much.